Hello, this is Brian of Tavaran Games again, and I've got an update on Dungeon Maker. Now, normally I do these videos once every 2 weeks or so, but I got a lot done on Dungeon Maker this last week, so I figured I'd make an update video a little early. So the things I'll be talking about, I got a character maker here, which allows you to basically put in the standard stats from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, with a focus on the numbered stats that affect dice rolls and less so the role-playing side, as well as the ability to set your character portrait on your computer, and then that is actually shared in multiplayer over the network, and I'll talk a little bit about that soon. I also have an enemy making script here, which allows the DMs to create enemies to put in their games, and that's been incorporated into the map maker, which we saw in the last video. And then I actually got the multiplayer working. It's pretty basic at the moment, but you can get multiple players in the game and they can run around the maps and have their own views of it. So yeah, I will talk about all those things. Let's start with the characters. So here's some characters I've already made. If we make a new one, I'm going to be lazy and just put in new name. So let's create that character. It'll immediately show up in the character list. Don't have the ability to delete characters quite yet, but you can go into your files and do that. So if we select the character, we end up in this pretty basic character sheet. I know it doesn't look pretty yet. I'm still using Unity's basic inputs and toggles and all that. But yeah, the first thing we can do is set our portrait. So I've made a rudimentary file explorer that lets us actually go through our directories and find it. So it remembers last place you were, as you saw I was in that little D&D folder. So, you know, I've got a bunch of drives, but this one's where I keep pictures. And then this D&D folder. And it will show you all the images in that folder. So let's say we can use this, that's for a different character, but whatever, we can use that as our image if we want. But it'll show you the different pictures you've got in a little preview up here. So yeah, let's make our character look like that. And boom, that character portrait is set. When you import it, the data is saved to file as raw data that can then be sent over the network as a message. So I'm somewhat limited in the size. The default messaging in Mirror, which I'm using for multiplayer, only allows smaller pictures to be sent as the raw data. I haven't figured out how to increase that bandwidth, so I'm pretty limited in picture size at the moment. I tried larger pictures, they wouldn't send. But the pictures are saved in your characters folder, so the save is here. So we can see this new name, and the new name, the .dmc is the character file, so it doesn't have any data yet. And then the picture file saved, they're all going to be the exact same size because it's just the raw data, same name. So yeah, we can edit our character. So, you know, let's say he's a strength constitution focus. So decent strength, good constitution, reasonable intelligence, not wise at all, and charismatic. Let's do that. So it updates the actual throws here, or the bonuses. We can then select our saving throws for proficiency. Now this is basic, it will just put your basic proficiency on, but that will update with your level. So once we get to level 5, you can see that goes up to +3. I think it's at level 9 it goes to +4. Level 20 it's +5 or 6 or whatever it is. So we can see the proficiency go up as our level goes up. So let's pretend we're a little level 1 character, whatever our stats are. So we also have our hit dice, and then this minimum critical roll, that's the attack critical roll, because for certain classes in D&D, I know your critical roll, like for a fighter, can go down to 19 or to 18. So because critical rolls have been built into the multiplayer, I need this so that I can determine when a critical actually happens. And yeah, we can do our skills. I don't show the proficiency bonus here yet because I just haven't written the script to link up these with the different stats here. So that's something I'll have to do in the future, and it's not really built into the game, the multiplayer version of the game yet. So for now, though, you can at least set them so that will end up in your save file. And then the most important thing is your attacks and spells, so your actions here. So I created this sort of window for you to be able to put in various attacks and spells, and I've tried to make it so that you can pretty much get anything from the player's manual into it. It's probably not perfect. It's more focused on the various spell qualities and attack qualities that would be used in an encounter against enemies, or for healing spells against your players. But I don't know if I've got everything. I've tried. If you see anything missing, please let me know. But let's say he has a longsword. Yeah, we'll go with a longsword. I think a longsword is slashing damage, so we can change the damage type to slashing. This doesn't have a saving throw. That's more for spells. So the range of this, is basically is melee for this, but you can set range. So for spells that are melee, like touch and one target, you would use melee, and for spells that are ranged one target, you can use ranged. And then we also have area spells, so that's your surrounding area. Ranged area, so that would be like fireball. So you can set the, if we look at that, you can set the size of it would be, 40 feet at a maximum distance of 200 feet or whatever it is, I don't remember. But we'll stick with melee for this. You then can put in your damage dice, so I think it's 1d8 for a longsword. Your bonuses, so you can just read over here, so it'd be +5 to hit, +3 damage because it's strength-based. And then I also put in extra damage, so this would be like if you have a longsword that also does fire damage. You could then put that in here. This click field is a little weird, and so 1d6 fire damage, whatever it is. So let's make that fire longsword. Let's say you have a really good one. And it will save as the action, and then it will tell you what it is. So this is a melee with +5 to hit, 1d8 +3 slashing, +1d6 fire. So we can do that for just about anything. So, you've got your longbow. We can set that to piercing and ranged and all those fun things. It will load up this window will have whatever your last action was in it. Just easier that way, not to reset it. I think a longbow is 150 and 600 feet. Which is definitely going to be more, 1d8. Now, longbow is dex-based, so yeah, he's not going to be good with this. That's, what, -1 to hit and -1 damage? Oof. No extra damage, whatever it is, we can save that. But yeah, it will tell you all that. When it's a negative, it's kind of funny because it goes +-. But yeah, so let's save this character and then return to the menu. So that's your characters. If you want to load a character up, we can look at one I've put in before. And it's got all of his stuff, so this would be, a level 5 dex focused. I think I made him a rogue, and his various things. So I gave him a fire rapier as well for fun. When you return to the main, it does save your character. Alright, so your character sheets can get in. Now let's look at enemies. So I made a couple enemies here. Let's say we wanted to make a new one. It's the same thing as characters, so create a new one. We get this enemy window. So I have support for medium, large, and huge enemies, and it will show you their size here. Again, I was talking about before, the image sizes are limited. So let's say we put in a frost giant picture. It ends up a little blurry because, again, I could only get smaller images to send as messages over the network to sync to all the players. The main reason for that is so that the game doesn't have to have a library of pictures for you to choose from. Instead, the players and the Dungeon Master can use whatever pictures they want, and those will sync over the network. I don't have to then worry about making up a huge library of images for people to use and the limitations of that, as well as trying to deal with licensing and copyright. Instead, players pick what they want. So yeah, this is the picture from the Dungeon Master Manual, but this would not be sold with the game. This would be just for my sessions. It would be used for my players in my session. In your game, you can use whatever pictures you want. But a skeleton, that would be medium. I actually got a skeleton picture here. So let's import that. He gets his picture set there. You can input the stats. I don't know what the base skeleton stats are off the top of my head. Whatever they end up being. Skeletons will be dumb and not very wise and horribly uncharismatic, whatever they are. And then you can put in the resistances and immunities. So you've got your acid, your bludgeoning, your cold. I had to shorten it to kind of fit it here. But all of those. And then their attack spells. It's the same type of thing for your player character, so that's not how you spell scimitar. Whatever it is, and then it would be whatever damage it does. So let's say he's got +4 to hit, +2. You go through the manual, the monster manual. You add up whatever you want and create it. So let's just save him. Return to the main menu. We can load up another enemy. So like here's the frost giant I made. So he's got a cold immunity. His attacks from the manual. All of his stats that'll be necessary for dice rolling, and we can return to main. So yeah, you can add in a bunch of enemies. So getting those in the game, now we can go into one. So a map I've shown before, I've already put some enemies in this. Hey, look at that, here they are. So you have the enemies, they'll show up here in this menu. Now this one I'm going to have as toggleable, like I'll have a little enemy button here that would then show this menu. And I also have to add scrolling to it. I haven't done that yet for when the Dungeon Master ends up with way too many enemies and needs to scroll to find them. But yeah, let's click an enemy. Now, if you want to delete an old enemy, like there's way too many here, so you can just click on those, get rid of them. But yeah, we can put in, say, a bugbear there. Let's grab an Ettercap I made. We can scroll around. Man, can you imagine this room? Everyone will be dead real fast. Yeah, so get rid of that. It's kind of funny just how many there are. You can get rid of him, you can place him. So if you want to move enemies around as the DM on your map making, you literally just place and replace. You can click them to get rid of them, move them somewhere else. I don't have a tool to like click one and then move it when it's already on the map. I'll probably put that in at some point, but for now, this solution works all right. So we have the enemies in the map, so let's just save that map and exit to menu. So we'll still be here. So yeah, let's actually host a campaign. So I'm going to host it from this window here. So let's host that map. So we're in the DM window. Now, the game IP will actually show up for the host, whatever it is. Now, just for this video, I've set it to 0 so that my IP address isn't blatantly on the screen for this video. But yeah, so the way the hosting over the network generally works is the host will get their IP address will be shown here once they start hosting the game. They can then tell their players what the IP is, and the players will then put that into theirs. So I've got some little Dungeon Maker windows of this build here. I just made those small. So we're going to join a campaign. Now, for the IP address, if you don't put anything there, it just is the local host. It will default to that. But you can put in that IP address that the DM's given you. So let's say Lander joins, and they'll load into the game. As you saw, it takes a second for the enemies to like size and for their image to be transferred. But those images are now visible here. Now, it's important. Those images are not saved to the game. They're saved to the Dungeon Master's files, and they're being sent over the network as data. So you can make whatever pictures you want. You don't have to have your players download those pictures or copy the map over onto their computer to then be able to play. Whatever the host has saved on their computer is transferred over to the players. So that makes it a lot easier to host. You can see the enemies in the way. So let's get this other window going. So let's have Ulrich join in. And boom, he pops in and they can see each other. As you can see, the Dungeon Master sees them. So the Dungeon Master just has a clear view and they can just move around freely. I got to make the movement a little bit faster, but they can see the whole map. They can't do much right now. I haven't put in their tools. But yeah, and then each of the players has their own view, so their light's being blocked. So like I can't see what's in this room until I get into this room. Oh, big and empty. But the DM can see all that. DM can see me running around. We get blocked by each other. And then the other thing I've got working is the actions are in the game. Now, there's no way for my character to, or your character to select their actions yet. I will be putting a menu on the side that has all of the character actions that are saved on it, as well as the saving throws, ability save, not ability saves, the skill throws, rolling initiative, and then just roll a dice. The different types of dice will be over in a menu on the side. I haven't put that in yet. Though for now, though, we have our first action selected. So if you remember for this character, it is that Fire Rapier. And when we click on an enemy, it will do that action to the enemy. And then the result will pop up in this notification window. So it's Fire Rapier, and we hit, so we did 7 piercing and 1 fire. Keep clicking. Oh, we did 5 piercing and 3 fire, and they died. Now, as you saw, so we got a critical hit on that one. If we click it, if once damage is done, I've got the classic D&D. They'll get a little bit of blood on their window when they hit 50% health. And then when they get below 25%, they get more blood. Below 10%, they get a lot of blood on them. And then once they get to 0, they get that red X. So that's the kind of basic D&D health indicator that's kind of set up in the Dungeon Master's manual instead of doing like a standard health bar. So it gives you a hint to how much health the enemy might have left, but you don't know exactly. But yeah, we got an immediate critical. And there, finally, we actually miss one. But the dice are being rolled, and the value is being interpreted based on the enemy AC. So we managed to hit him. Ooh, we're hitting him quite a lot. His AC is only 15, I guess. But there we go. We finally missed some. Now, for him, he's got... So there's the basic blood. So he's now below 50% health. We keep clicking. Lots of clicking. Now we're getting a lot of misses. Little more blood, and boom, we end up killing him. Now, for the dragon, you can see we get a lot more misses because his AC is 18. So we could keep clipping. Now, if you look over here, of course, you see that status is being transferred to all the players. So he can start clicking. Oh, don't know why his notification is not being applied there. Gonna have to figure out what happened. But yeah, so the basic multiplayer is working. And yeah, so those are the main things I've got in the game. So for those interested in just what I've been working on, that's basically the end of the video for you. For anyone else, let's jump into the code a little bit so you can see sort of how I got all that working. So, ton of code. So I've got a ton of different files. So let's start with that character editor. So the character editor has all the different inputs, which are mostly just public fields where I can move those input fields or toggle switches into the file publicly and don't have to try to find them. And then we go in and it has a check to see, does the file exist for the player sprite is the first thing it actually checks. And if it does, it unpacks that data and saves it to a new texture. And then it uses that texture to create a sprite for that for the portrait so that it can be displayed. And then it's basically fills in sort of the default stats it needs to in order to actually save a file, just in case there's no character to load if you haven't actually made it yet. And then it checks, the save file will exist when you first create the character, but then it has to check, is there any data in that file? Because when you first create the character, it doesn't have any data in it until you go to this screen and actually make it. But if you had made the data before, it will then actually run a load function, which is down here, and it actually loads that data. So the character save is just a class. Let's go over here. So it just has all the data that is actually being saved. So this is what I think is going to be needed for the game. I might be missing some stuff that would actually be useful for dice rolling inside. But as I said, most of the role-playing stuff can be dealt with, tableside and actually just talking with your DM, and isn't really needed for the game to function. So this is just all the things that will actually affect dice rolling are in here, and that's what's in the game. So back to the editor, you've got that. Now when you want to save the character, it runs this, and that actually grabs the data out of all the fields and saves it to the appropriate integer or list or whatever in the save file. For the actually running it, so you've got like these basic functions. The modifier, this is your proficiency modifier, so that can be calculated when you update the proficiency, and then it will actually display those. For the stats, this is how it's displaying all your different proficiencies, all that. The actions, when you're updating it, so when you want to add an action, it just moves that action window into place. Same thing when you edit one, except then it tells it to load whatever action it is. You can delete actions, and then when you save it, it then grabs it and makes sure it's going to the right place in the list of actions you have. So if you're editing one, it will overwrite one. If you're adding one, it will add it to the list. And then for the update, this is it actually saving that action from the action creator into the character so that it can then be saved in the save file. So the action, again, is bug function. So this is everything I figure is needed to actually get the various spells and effects into the game. Honestly, I might be missing stuff. I know there's various spells like where it has an effect like let's say I don't know, the web spell that entangles your character so they can't move and have to do a save throw every round. I haven't put that in. I think that would make this like insanely complicated, and that action making window would end up massive. But it has the things of, you've got your ranges, you've got the damage it does, as well as your hit bonus, your damage bonus, the damage type, and then extra damage if it also does, say, fire damage on a sword or cold damage or whatever, and the type of that damage. Now, the actual damage type is not being used in the game yet, but the data's there, so I'll be able to do that. And duration for area of effect spells. Again, I haven't coded in how that works, but it's going to get in the game eventually. And then for that action maker, you saw the window there. Where is it? This is display. Ooh, I don't even think I have that open. Let's go to my scripts. No, we have the action display. So this is how we display it. I am trying to remember where I put that. Well, whatever. It's a script somewhere. Oh, wait, I called it create action. There it is. My silliness. I am tired. But yeah, so for creating an action, this is that window that popped up has this script. So it's got all the input fields it needs, and those are all public. It then has things for a few of the buttons when, you change the value of the range, the saving throw, or whether there's extra damage. It will then make the appropriate fields interactable or not. And then also make sure whether you're in the character or an enemy editor, because it's the same script for both, so why code it twice? And then you've got the various functions. So saving it, it's literally just grabbing all that data you have. It's also determining which of the data needs to be updated and saved. So for things where there is a saving throw, so this doesn't equal num, it needs to save the save amount and the duration of it. Otherwise, it just defaults those to 0. So same thing for the ranged. It just defaults it to 5 each for melee, and then if it's actually ranged or if it's an area attack or a cone, it updates the appropriate range field, because these just can't be blank. And then extra damage, again, if there is extra damage, it saves that damage, otherwise it just makes those zeros. And then it saves all that information, a few other functions for toggling things, and then for loading it, it can set the values correctly when you go to edit in action. That ended up being a fairly long script. But yeah, so that handles the actions, and then that's able to save that back to the character editor. And yeah, so that's the character editor. The enemy editor is pretty similar, it just has fewer fields because the enemy doesn't need quite as much data to function. But yeah, it's got all the fields and does pretty much the exact same thing. Now for the setting those images is all done in this file explorer I wrote. Even though this is really the image saver, I call it File Explorer because oh yeah, we can use this for multiple different files and getting things. And then I've pretty much just limited it to pictures at the moment. But it's got the various game objects it needs are all public, and those can be put in. And then when it first starts, it sees, have you used this before? And if you have, it goes straight back to that folder and loads that directory. Otherwise, it just loads your base hard drives at the start. So the load drives is just looking at your drive info and then displaying that information of the drive letters so that you can then go through the drives and find the folder you need. The scrolling is just basically updating which file you're looking at. So, and it's basically just using these offsets and then reloading the directories. When it's loading a directory, this is where most of it happens. So the first thing it does is it looks at where it gets the parent directory, because there is a go up to parent button, so that way you can actually go back. And then it'll display that in the corner, or it'll add that to that button and make sure that you can actually click that button to go up a directory. It then gets rid of all of its buttons, sets the offset for the height of those buttons, and then if you scroll down a bit, if your offset of the directories is, it will actually add in that scroll button, which is just an up arrow using slashes. And then it grabs, basically it checks, does this directory exist? It just as a check. And then it grabs all the directories in it, and it displays buttons for each of them. And then if there are more directories than can be displayed, so there's room for 15 directories or 15 buttons. If there's more than that, it adds the little down arrow button so that you can scroll down. And then it does the exact same thing for files. Now in this case, it checks to see, is it a JPEG or a PNG image, because that's what the code can handle for importing images. I mean, the code might work for GIFs and bitmaps, but I have not tested that, and honestly, most people will work with JPEGs and PNGs anyway, so you can just convert it in an image editor if you want. But it does the same thing, except this time it's grabbing the files, which is here. So instead of get directories, it's directory get files, and then displays those. Now this is where the image resizing happens. So this was really important to be able to import the images, is I had to be able to make them a size that could be sent over the net, like saved as raw data and sent over the network. So I have to thank a guy named Adrian Babulinski on GitHub. That's where I found the code to do this. Everything else I basically wrote from going through the Unity documentation and then the multiplayer mirror documentation and all that. But I could not bloody figure out how to resize an image to save it as a smaller texture. So thank you, Adrian, for making your code available. And so what he did is he uses a render texture. So it creates a new render texture, makes it active, and then uses this. I have no idea. I didn't know this code existed, but this blit will basically replicate the texture you've loaded in, this new texture. So that's the image file data. And then it will apply that to the render texture. And then you can resize the original texture, which gets rid of all the data. That was the problem, is when you resize a texture in Unity, all of the image data disappears. But when you save that information to this render texture beforehand, you can then reapply it in its new size, and it will resize using this function. So it works brilliantly. It resizes it to whatever size you need. So you can set the size. In here, I'm actually using a vector at the top, which is set publicly for the size, so it's 70 by 70, but that can be changed. Now, unfortunately, I tried bigger images and they just would not go over the network. So we're stuck with 70 by 70 for now until somebody can tell me how to send more data over mirror networking. But yeah, so that data is then saved as is applied to the preview. Now, when you save the data, what it does is it creates the correct file. So in the case of characters, it's going to the character folder. In the case of enemies, it goes to the enemy folder. The player prefs is where the name of the character or enemy is being saved when you're on this page, or not on this page, in that scene to actually edit it. And then it adds this Dungeon Maker sprite file type. Just a meaningless file type, but it lets me keep track of the different types of things that are being saved. And then it basically just saves the raw sprite data as standard byte data so that it can be sent over a network in the future. And that's what's being loaded whenever you open your character sheet or when you enter the game. Yeah, so that was fun to code up, and it is working pretty well. The image is resized, and the raw data is saved fine. Every single image file in this game is now a 26 kilobyte raw data file, as you see here. And so the character names aren't actually saved in the files. It's the file names are the character names. And then it can basically just look and see, okay, here is a DMC file with that name, that's character, and then here is a DMS file with the same name, so that's the picture for that character. Let's delete this new one we created because it's useless. And yeah, we've got our previous ones. Oh yeah, I haven't even set. So you can see for this other character, it doesn't have a sprite yet. So it would just use that default human sprite. But yeah, so that's the file explorer. So the networking, that was the big one. So if we go to the networking, I was not able to get networking working using Unity's built-in networking which they're developing, because I could not get it to sync variables properly. It wouldn't sync the map data. I tried for like 2 days to get it to work, and then I said, you know what, I remember a networking thing I kind of played with a few years ago called Mirror. And so I used that. So Mirror is a free extension for Unity, which deals with server-side networking. So I've created this network manager, basically using tutorials and various data that Mirror has to replace the original, because there's a few things it has to do. So when it first adds a player, it checks, are there any players in the game? And if there aren't, if this is the first player, that is going to be the host. So the DM the host has to be the first. So this is how I determine that, yeah, this is the host. So when the host is added, it creates an object I call the mirror data object. So that's a prefab in the game. If we go into the prefabs, it's over here. So it's an object that has this mirror data script. So what that script is holding, so let's actually look at the mirror data. It should be open. So the mirror data script is holding the map data. So that is the ID of every object in the map, its location, and then it's got a variable list to associate that. So the object IDs are being synced as integers, because I couldn't sync a string since strings are non-nullable. So I have to sync an integer for that. So every object that can be placed on the map basically has to be added to this list. And then when the first player, the host, logs in, it sets the reference data. So that's this data here, which is the bare data for, this is an integer you can use to ID with a brick wall and what object type it is. And then it goes and sets the actual map data. So it goes through your map file, make sure that that exists. So we talked about those files in the previous video. And then it loads that data and it goes through, and for every object ID, it goes through this list of the raw data of all the different things that can be placed, and then basically gets the integer of like literally where the index where it is in the list. And it just saves that index as an integer to this object IDs, and then it saves its location as a vector too, because that's non-nullable as well, so that can be synced over the network. So it does that for all of those. Oh, actually, I can get rid of this because that was something I was playing with, and it didn't work on this file. So it does that. So then the map data is synced over the network as those variables on the mirror data object, and that's visible to any player that logs in. Then we have to load the enemies. So the enemies are a little bit different because they have an enemy name and some more data. And they're each sort of their own unique object that has its own sync variables. So for that, I've got these enemy prefabs that are part of the network manager as spawnable objects. It's just recompiling there. Which have an enemy mirror script. We'll look at that in a minute. That can control their stuff as well. Yeah, their network identity, colliders, the network transform. So if they move, which I don't have the ability for them to move in the game yet, but once that's in, that will make sure it is all synced up across all the players. But yeah, so it instantiates the correct size enemy. So you saw there's the 3 prefabs for the medium, the large, and the huge enemies. So it'll spawn whichever one it's supposed to, and then it will save the name of the enemy to it, so that the enemy can load up the correct stats and image for itself, and just basically cleans up a bit and spawns it to the server. So that's what happens when the first player logs in, and then it actually instantiates the player itself, and adds them and connects them to the network. So let's look at that enemy mirror file here. So it has the synced variables are the ones that can be seen by everyone and need to be seen by everyone in order to do calculations. So the health, the HP, the armor class, as well as the name. And then there's sort of the hidden variables that only really the enemy itself needs to do for their saving throws. So those variables won't interact with the players. So when they load in, it makes sure the file exists for the sprite, and if it does, it loads that sprite in and then sets the size of the portrait so that the sprite actually fills the whole space of the enemy. And so it loads that data in, it sets it to point filter mode just so it doesn't look quite so blurry, and creates the sprite for it. And then it goes through the enemy save file and it loads in its stats from that file as well as its actions. And then with the update, there's not much the enemy can do. Right now, the only thing it's updating, it's checking, has the health been changed? And if so, if the health reaches certain levels, so if it's below 50%, make that blood effect visible on it, and then set the sprite for that based on how much their health is. So when it's between 25 and 50, it's that first light blood. When it's between 25 and 10, it's that heavier blood. When it's below 10% but hasn't reached 0, it's that really bloody mess. And then finally, if it reaches 0, it sets that red X to signify they're dead. And then it also just makes sure on the server, if the health is higher than the maximum HP, to just set the health to the maximum HP. So if there's healing effects, it won't go above its maximum. So that's the enemy class. So they can't do much yet. I need to add in functions so that the Dungeon Master can select the enemy and actually move them around and perform actions for them. Once I have that, that's pretty much the interactivity of the game. Most of the interactivity I need done. Okay, so let's look at that player. When the player spawns, this script is a little more complicated. So looking at the player, they too have all the stats in it that they need. They also have things needed for movement, so the layer mask, the wall mask, basically where everything, the utilities are, the notification window, as well as their name, which is public. And so when the server loads, this is basically the Dungeon Master. So if you start as the server, you're set to the Dungeon Master. So this is where it grabs your IP address, and then that is displayed. Now, there is an additional player controller that's the single player script. So that one is needed, or I did that one because that can already be in the scene, and it can have basically the windows pushed into it as public game objects as well as the light. So that way, those are things that will only be seen by that current player, and those don't need to go over the network or be synced. So this is where we're updating that light, which is just a spline point. It draws out rays and puts the points on the spline to then cover up parts of the scene you can't see, anything being blocked by walls. And then as well, this is actually syncs up movement. So there is a single player movement in it if you want to just run around the single player just as the DM, just to make sure your map is navigable and looks how you want. But this is mostly to control the camera and lighting and the notifications window. On the mirror side, we are then instead working on the actual multiplayer stuff. So your IP address is grabbed if you're the dungeon master, if you're the server, and it is displayed. Again, I've just made it so it's 000 right now, so that my IP address isn't in the video. But if you get this game in the future, you will be able to see your IP address so that you can give that to your players. And you don't have to worry about matchmaking. You just tell your players log into this right now and this IP, and boom, they're in the game. So if you're the player, it loads up your stuff. It also has the messaging handler for the sprite messages. So this is how the sprite messages are being sent over the network. We'll look at that in a second. It grabs all the things it needs to be able to sort of navigate. So the wall mask, default mask, make sure you don't run over anybody or go through walls when you try to move. It grabs the map data here. So that was the map data set before by the server. And then so it clears the map. It grabs all the map IDs, and then it draws the map using a load encounter multiplayer script just to keep the functions a little bit separate. So that's where the clear map is. So it just destroys everything visible from the previous map. And then it basically just draws in the new ones and sets them to where they're supposed to be. So we just have the walls, floors, utilities so far, but there will be other types of objects. So furniture, wall objects, so stuff like paintings and torches that are on the walls. And floor out covering, so rugs and stuff. So I still have to get that in the game. So let's go back here. So that actually draws the map data, and then once it does that, it loads up from your save file all of your stats and saves them to the correct variables. Some of which are public. So your health is public right now. I'll probably have to make the armor class public or synced. Sorry, I should say they're all public. The synced versions are not. So your health is synced to the server. I will probably sync the armor class as well so that the enemies can grab that data to be able to run their throws. But that's not in the game yet. And it grabs in your actions, and then it positions your player, which is a separate function. So position player is down here. I already have that open. So it grabs the start position game object, wherever it is, and then it places you somewhere. It tries to place you in a random position within that box. It's a 5x5 box. If that position is empty, it puts you there. It'll attempt 100 times just to prevent this while loop from continuing forever if for some reason the start position area is completely full. If this fails, it just puts you at 0, 0. It puts you at the game origin. But if it can put you in the starting box, it does, and then it updates your position, or it updates your single player position, and then it updates the light covers, so that makes sure that parts of the map aren't visible. So looking at these other functions, so the sprite messages and enemy message, this is the actual byte data of their pictures, as well as who it belongs to on the server using the uint, which is server identity as an integer. So it's basically saying this is your network number. And then for the sprite messages, it has a bool asking, do I need a response? So when a player first logs into the server, they'll send out their sprite data to everyone, but then they have to get the data from everyone else, because when they first log in, like everyone would then be able to see their sprites, but they wouldn't be able to see the other players. So it asks, send me a response, I need to set your data. So then basically when you log in, everyone updates their sprites and everybody can see each other. For the enemies, it's slightly different. So it has the identity, but it also has a specific send to. So when you log in, you set all the enemy sprites, but because they don't need to see you, we don't need to update everybody on all the enemy sprites. So when you receive a sprite, it takes that data, it then goes through all the players and matches up the network identities with the identity sent in the message. And if they match, it sets the data so that it's nicely visible. In the case of the Dungeon Master, it just makes them invisible. The Dungeon Master actually does have an object in the game. It's just made invisible. Because basically, like, they will spawn in as a player, and this was my way of dealing with that. Now, if you're supposed to respond, you actually send your own data over with your ID and say, I don't need a response. Like, I was already in the game. I can see everyone else. We good. And so then it sends that sprite over the network. For the enemies, it's a similar thing. It just goes through the enemies. It just also has size constraints. So it checks if they're larger enemies, make them bigger, and then apply their data. So that is working. And then this offloading a sprite is basically on the network side. So this is when the network gets the data. it's basically sending everyone the data. So sorry, when you log in, you send your sprite data to the server, and then this basically offloads that and sends that to everybody. As well, when you first log in, this is basically seeing, okay, the message response is only true for a player that's just logged in. Send the enemy data out as well, and tell that to only go to that, like to only be opened by that person. And yeah, so the upload sprite is just when you log in, this is what's sending the data from the client to the server. Yeah, so that is how the sprites are all syncing, and that works pretty well. Again, it's limited in the amount of data it can send. So I tried 170 by 170 pixel sprites, and those would not sync over the network. I'm not sure what the maximum sprite size that can be sent is, or how to increase the data size. There's no field in Mirror for me to increase the amount of message bandwidth. Even though it used to exist, it does not anymore, apparently. So I haven't been able to figure that out. If anyone knows how or where in the Mirror files to change that, please let me know. So moving on, there's some other important things. So we've got the roll dice. So this is what actually can roll dice for you. So it takes in the number of dice to be rolled, it takes in the type of dice to be rolled, and it takes in the bonus to be added to that. And then so the result starts out as the bonus. And then for the number of dice, it rolls individual dice and it rounds the value up. So if the dice is, say, a D8, it will take a random value multiplied by 8. So that will then be a value between 0 and 8. Now, we don't want zeros. All dice have ones as the lowest number. So this rounds them up to the nearest thing. And it won't be able to go above the type. If it's 8, it'll just stay at 8. So this ensures we get an integer value out between 1 and the type of dice that's put into it. Then say I've got this attack enemy script that takes in the enemy that's supposed to be hit, the damage that's being done to that enemy, and the types of damage. And then at the moment it's just applying it to the health damage to the enemy. It's not checking any resistances or anything. The damage is just set. So I'll have to edit this in the future to incorporate those resistances and immunities that the enemy has. And then there's also the movement. So the movement function is basically just, can I move in that direction? Well, basically it uses a raycast to check, is there anything in my way? And if not, move me in that direction, and then update the position, the single player position, and which updates the camera, and then the lighting cover. So where is my update? Here it is. So under update, I have the not Dungeon Master controls. So this has tile-based movement. So you move one tile at a time. And then that's what that movement function is doing. So this is where it's actually dealing with the attack. So we have if you click, get the mouse position, and then see if you hit anything on the default layer. So that's the stuff that can be interacted with. If that thing is an enemy, and you basically have an action selected, so if the action number is which action you've selected. Again, I haven't made a way for this to be changed in game yet, so at the moment it's just set to the first action. But it will then be like, okay, that's an attack action, and it's an enemy. Let's go. So first it rolls the to hit dice, and it rolls it without the bonus because it needs to check if it's a critical. And then it sets the damage is to 0, and it says you haven't hit them yet. So if the to hit's above the critical, so if you've actually hit a critical, it then basically adds 100 to hit to make it a guaranteed hit on the enemy. And then it rolls the damage dice, so you can see it doubles the dice number, and then basically the dice type stays the same, the damage bonus stays the same. If there's additional damage, it doubles up those dice as well, and then sets hit to true. If it's not a critical, it has to check, do you actually hit? So it actually adds your hit bonus on here, if it's not a critical, and then it checks, is that above the armor class of the enemy? And if so, roll the normal amount of dice and make those the damage. Then down here, if you've actually hit the enemy, it is applying that damage in that damage function, so it's setting all the things here. And then it is updating that notification window with the hit type. So if to hit's greater than 100, like that means it's critical. I think it's pretty impossible to get a to hit value greater than 100 without adding 100 to it. And then so it'll tell you it's critical hit as well as the damage is. Otherwise, it just says it's a hit. It just shows you the damage that was done as well as the action name. And then same thing for if there's extra damage, except for the extra damage, it adds that damage on as well over here. And then otherwise, though, if you miss, it just tells you action missed. So that lets the player know what they've done. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for it. But it is all working pretty well in game. So we have a character editor, an enemy editor, the ability to add enemies to your map, as well as the previous map making tools I showed in the previous video. And then the ability to actually join in those campaigns in multiplayer and interact with the enemies a little bit. So going forward, I need to make it so that the Dungeon Master can actually move those enemies around and perform their actions, as well as I need to make that dice rolling window for the players, as well as for the Dungeon Master with whatever enemy they have selected, and make it so that they can change what action they have chosen. And then I actually, for the healing spells, which are part of the actions, I need to incorporate that those can actually function on people and will add to their health, not subtract. And then I need to add in on the multiplayer, in the multiplayer scene, a window over on the right-hand side, which will show like basically the actions that everyone's taken. So all the different dice rolls that have been occurring. So you can see what everyone's rolling and the DM can see it too. Once I have all that in, I think the game will be in a really good state, and I'll be able to share it in the alpha build. And then I'll just be adding in different placeable objects, different abilities to edit the map, as well as the ability to create a campaign map and to mark the different encounter maps on that, and have it so that the players can see the campaign map, but then the Dungeon Master will have the ability to click on their own encounter maps, which will be hidden to the players, and transfer the players into a specific encounter. And then that will be a complete, Dungeons & Dragons campaign tool thing. If you have any ideas for different features you'd like to see or changes you think should be made, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoy these videos and seeing the progress I'm making on my development projects, feel free to subscribe, as well as support me on Patreon if you feel so inclined. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.